The scene is laid underwater. The story is based on the record of fossils found in sedimentary rocks 500 million years old. The ancient life of this time was made up of sea plants and little animals without backbones called invertebrates. The most highly developed of these ancient animals were the trilobites. They ruled the seas for 100 million years. Life continued in the warm, shallow seas. The rule of the trilobites was over. Now, this is about 445 million years ago. Other kinds of invertebrate sea animals called the cephalopods now played the leading role. The name cephalopod simply means having feet on the head. Cephalopod, can you say that? Cephalopod, that means having feet on your head, like a squid or an octopus. Squid and octopus of today belong to that same family. No life lived on land, but the lowly little lichens clinging for dear life to the bare rocks are the pioneers of the plant world. So you can see here, there are the cephalopods that are moving about in this waterway and the small green plants. And now that is in the Paleozoic era. So this is 440 million years ago. And now we're at 375 million years ago. So 375 million years ago in the Paleozoic era, the scene has changed as land slowly rose when it moved upwards. The seas retreated or evaporated, leaving salt deposits. A few of the water plants left high and dry became land plants, the ancestors of the liverworts and the mosses of today. The cephalopods had decreased in size and in numbers. Sea scorpions had taken over the rule of the seas. Little jawless fish appeared on the scene, the first animals to have backbones called vertebrates. So we are a vertebrate. We have a backbone. And the invertebrate, which is the one with the cephalopod, the one with the head that has the feet connected to it, they were invertebrates. So here, during the Paleozoic era, we can see the sea scorpion. Now, 350 million years ago, still in the Paleozoic era, we are now in a different scene. Land plants flourished, clothing our once bare earth in green. Ferns made the first appearance at this time, also early forms of horsetails, club mosses, and scale trees. These plants, instead of creeping along close to the ground, had roots of their own, stems and leaves, and stood up, reaching for the life-giving warmth and light of our sun. The long age of invertebrates had come to an end. Seas, lakes, rivers, and streams swarmed with fish. Big fish, little fish, and medium-sized fish. A few even developed lungs and crawled from a puddle to puddle on land. So still in the Paleozoic era, you can see this is Dinichthys, which I think that Miles will be interested in. There's Dinichthys and all the other creatures that I hope you will be able to learn about when you get this book. Here's the lovely photograph of the trees, or excuse me, the plants that are starting to grow upwards instead of creep along the ground, and the different creatures along inside the river or oceans. Now, about 315 million years ago in the Paleozoic era, this is the new scene. The land was low, The climate, warm and moist, great swamp forests covered much of our Earth. This period is called the Age of Plants, or the Coal Age, because most of the coal we use today comes from these ancient plants. Amphibians, another kind of vertebrate, appeared on the scene. They were animals that lived their early life in water and their adult life on land, like the frogs of today. Insects were present and abundant. So we have insects, amphibians, seed ferns. We have other types of plants that are growing. This is the Coal Age, where there was tons of plants. And these plants during this time is what we use today as coal to fuel our vehicles and factories. Now, about 235 million years ago, there was mountains that rose high and the climate turned cold and dry. Glaciers formed and swamps became deserts. This was a time of crisis in our Earth's history. Life, in order to survive, was forced to adapt or to change. Hardy seed-bearing conifers replaced the swamp trees. Conifers are the ones with cones, like the cone that I have, the pine cones that come off of pine trees, conifers. The land-living reptiles displaced the amphibians. Reptiles lay hard-shelled eggs on dry land. Amphibians lay soft eggs in the water. Now, we have a couple of the dinosaurs that possibly our friends at home might know. Do we know the name of this? I'll give you some time to guess. That one's the Dimetrodon. There he is. From about 200 million years ago, the climate grew milder. Streams and rivers eroded the mountains. Reptiles continued to play the leading roles. Dinosaurs, member of the reptile family, appeared on the scene. Dinosaurs, instead of crawling on their stomachs, stood up and walked on 4 legs or on 2. A few of the reptiles returned to a life in the water. So this is in the Mesozoic era. And so there are some of the creatures that you may recognize here that she has drawn. Do we know what this one is? Or this one? And here they are in the scene. It's much different from what it was in the beginning. So Ichthyosaur is the one that's here on the bottom. And then we have the Plateosaurus, which is here. And a couple other ones. You're gonna have to get this book. I promise you'll love it. So about 168 million years ago, still in the Mesozoic era, also called the Jurassic Period. Once again, the climate was warm and moist. Some of the plant-eating dinosaurs had grown tremendous. Some had developed armor for protection from their meat-eating cousins, and some reptiles had learned how to fly. The first real bird appeared, and little mammals were present, but they played a very small role at this time. So we have now, you can see the Stegosaurus and the Brontosaurus and the Allosaurus and a couple other dinosaurs, but you can see there they are. It looks much different in that portion of the world than it did before. Now, 130 million years ago, mountains were slowly rising. The climate was growing cooler. Shallow seas flooded the lowlands, and on land, sea, and in the air, the reptiles ruled. Now, flowering plants appeared for the first time. So now we're in the Cretaceous period. And this one is where you're gonna see like the Plesiosaurs or the Elasmosaurus or Gorgosaurus. So here's some of the dinosaurs here. And this is what the scene looks like now. Earth on land and in the water and in the sea. There are animals teeming with life all over. Now we're at 95. We're getting closer to now 95,000 or million, years ago. Mountains continue to rise. The climate grew colder and colder. The shallow seas retreated, leaving deserts. One by one, members of the ruling family of reptiles disappeared from the scene, never to be seen on Earth again, except as fossils in museums of natural history. So we're in Upper Cretaceous Period right now, also known in the Mesozoic Era. There's tons of dinosaurs, but one that you might know, Tyrannosaurus Rex. And here they are, very large. Now, 60 million years ago, now we're in the Seen Epoch, which is a dawn to the recent times of now, sort of the beginning of what is at our space right now. Back in that time is when it started. So the scene has changed. The once high lands were now low. The cold, dry climate had turned hot and humid. Dense tropical forests covered most of the lowlands, and the few survivors of the reptile family now played a minor role. The leading roles had been taken over by birds and mammals. Mammals bear their young alive and take care of them until they are old enough to take care of themselves. Both birds and mammals are warm-blooded animals, while others are cold-blooded. And here's the beautiful scene here. Now, about 40 million years ago, now volcanoes began to erupt and mountains started to rise again. The climate grew a little cooler and drier. True grasses increased and spread at this time. They are members of the great family of flowering plants. Mammals were developing and experimenting in various forms. Although they are the ancestors of our present mammals, it is difficult to recognize some of them. So here are some of the animals that may have existed during that time. And she draws a whole list of them over here on the side. What does that look like, maybe? Maybe rhinoceros? Mountains continue to rise, and this is about 30 million years ago. And volcanoes continued to erupt, and the climate grew steadily cooler and drier. Grasses spread rapidly, making open plains instead of forests. Plant eaters changed their diets of leaves to one of grass. The rule of mammals was now at its height. A few of them grew very big and tall, the largest land mammals of all time. That's what happened during this time. You can see these beautiful animals and how large they were. About 12 million years ago, volcanoes and mountains building had reached their climax at this time. The climate had grown exceedingly cold and dry. Life was very difficult for the plants and animals. Grasses had dried up and plains were now deserts. Earlier forms of mammals had become extinct. Their surviving forms now looked more like the mammals we know today. So here's the ancient elephant and some of the other creatures that you might recognize. And here you can see the mountains are at their height, very tall. It's getting cooler. Now, about 1 million years ago, in the north, great glaciers formed and slowly moved southward, scraping the land bare. This time in life's history on Earth is called the Ice Age. 4 times these great masses of ice advanced, and 4 times they melted and retreated. Man was most probably present at this time, but he played a very minor role. So here you can see some of the prehistoric animals here, like the woolly mammoth. And there they are in the scene. The appearance of man on the scene happened only a short time ago as compared to the long length of time that all other life had been present. This is about 25 million years ago. Oh, excuse me, 25,000, 25,000. Prehistoric man lived in caves and discovered the use of fire. He made tools and weapons of stone and pieces of bone. He hunted the wild animals for food and clothing, and he painted pictures of these animals on the walls and caves. So on this side, you can see she has the cave paintings that the early man would have painted on the caves, and here they are inside the cave. And so, again, there has been new information about how further back we have evidence of man being present. So I would check your facts. Right here it says 25,000 years ago. It may be a little bit further back in time. We can always fact check ourselves. From about 10,000 years ago now, okay? Man learned how to cultivate plants and domesticate animals for his own use. Instead of wandering around and living in caves, he built houses and lived in villages, towns, and cities. He found out how to build boats and to sail high seas. With the development of languages, recorded history began. Historians tell the story of the rise and fall of great civilizations of old world and the discovery of the new world. So here we have people creating things, building things, living in communities. Now, about 350 years ago, the scene is set in the New World, not long after it was first discovered. Here, the early settlers cleared the land, cutting down the trees and building log cabins. The many rocks and boulders left by the glaciers were used to build stone walls and to divide up the land. The life of the early settlers was not an easy one, but they did not mind. Now, for the first time, they were working on land of their very own. So here you can see the progression of how they cleared the land to create the farmlands and then the farm. And here's where they have their crops for food and for their livestock, which is the animals that they are keeping, like horses and cows and chickens. Now, about 200 years ago, when our grandparents were young, our country was mostly a farming country. The wilderness had been turned into rich farmland. The farmer worked hard to make a living from the soil. He rose early to milk the cows and to feed the livestock. In the springtime, he plowed and planted his crops. And in the summer, he cultivated them and made hay. And in the fall, he gathered the harvest and stored it away for winter. So here you can see how the farm is evolving, how they've created a space for them to grow the things they need. And look at how beautiful that is. Just like we're growing our gardens in our backyard, this is on a much larger scale, but similar. Now, about 100 years ago, and now, a few generations later, the once well cared for farms were deserted. The farmers had either gone west or moved into the cities. The fields were overgrown with briar bushes and trees, and all that remained to show that man had lived here were the stone walls dividing the land and a few old apple trees. So this is telling the story of where she began to live. So here, there is a sign that says, "For sale." And I like to imagine that this is Virginia Lee Burton. I think that it's intended to be with her husband and her children. and they see an overgrown wooded area where there once used to be people living, but now it's just a lot of land with beautiful trees. So 25 years ago for her, summers have passed quickly since we bought the old orchard, meadow, and woodland and moved a little house and my barn studio into the middle of it. The old apple trees have been trimmed, the woods cleaned up, and in the meadow we have put sheep and to keep the grass down. Evergreens and flowering plants have been planted. Ferns and mosses grow by the running brook. Here's where we raised our children until they grew old enough to begin living a life of their own. So, remember the book, The Little House? They moved the house out into the perfect spot of the orchard, and this is where she used to draw. How lovely is that? The season has changed from summer to fall. The days are shorter, the nights are longer, the air is cooler, and the first frost nips the plants, turning the green leaves to bright red, orange, and yellow before they are caught by the wind and flutter to the ground. Only the hardy evergreens are not affected by the cold. The sap in the trees and the shrubs sink low in the roots, and the seeds for next year's plants have been shed. Sink low into the roots, and the seeds for next year's plants have been shed, which means that they have already fallen. Many birds fly south to escape the winter. So here's what it looks like in the fall. All the beautiful red trees. So beautiful. Last winter was a long and cold one with freezing temperatures, icy winds, and snowstorms. And when the sun did shine, it gave out little warmth. Down in the frozen ground, life in the plants slept beneath the blanket of dead leaves and deep snow, resting and waiting for the coming of spring. Little by little, the days grew longer. In the first month of spring, the snow melted and the ground thawed. Day by day, week by week, the grass grew greener. Gentle showers encouraged the early spring flowers, and in the trees, the sap was rising, swelling the new buds. Under the ground, last year's seeds began to stir and awaken, pushing tender shoots up through the earth and dead leaves, reaching up for the light and warmth of the sun. And then the birds returned from the south. Yesterday was a day to remember. One of those beautiful, warm spring days when one can almost see the plants growing. Lowly little lichens clinging to the rocks brightened. Liverworts and velvety mosses carpeted the damp ground. Ferns pushed up and unfurled their delicate fronds. New bright green needles tipped the evergreens. Buds opened and tiny little leaves unfolded, and the apple trees burst into blossom. In the meadow, the sheep grazed happily, and on the tender new shoots of grasses, the miracle of spring was here. You can see now Virginia Lee Burton was a special author. She would always paint and draw her pictures before she wrote the words to her book. So it was so magical. She would imagine these beautiful pictures and then she put words to them. As the afternoon hours slipped by and the sun began to sink in the west, the shadows on the ground gradually lengthened. Just before the sun set, it turned fiery red, tinting the sky and the earth bright pink. High overhead, the pale new moon appeared. By the brook, The frogs were singing their song of spring. Here, I just want the sunset turn the sky pink. I love sunsets and sunrises. Have you seen a sunset? The new moon had set and darkness had fallen. One by one the stars had come out. Millions and billions of stars, trillions of miles away. The Big Dipper hung high in the bright spring sky, pointing out the steady standing North Star. Low on the horizon gleamed the Milky Way, and inside the house the hands of the clock showed that another day had passed and a new day had begun. So here's her clock, that she shows you that the day has been turning and going, slowly coming to an end. And there's the beautiful stars. And now it is dawn, dawn of a new day, a day in spring. Minute by minute, the light brightens in the east, turning from cold gray to deep blue to delicate pink. The birds are singing gaily as they await the return of the sun. Down in the green meadow, there is a new baby lamb. And now I believe now I leave you and turn the story over to you. Look out your window, and in a few seconds, you will see the sun rise. And here, she's waiting and waiting for the new day, the sunrise. And then, from the very long time ago, time has spun all the way around, finally, to us. Right here, right now. And this is a museum that she drew, where you could go and see all the fascinating creatures that lived before us. Bum, bum, all done. This was a very long book, but it's filled with beautiful things. I hope you go and get this book and read it and study it and look at all the pictures and find new things to learn about. I hope that today you go out and pick your flowers and give them to someone you love, but also take time to love yourself and love those who are around you by giving them a hug or a kiss, or writing them a story. I miss all of you. I hope to see you soon.